Hello, everybody. I want to give you a warm welcome, also on behalf of the Inclusive Society Institute and the Daily Maverick, to this final round of the LB6 Constitutional Insights webinars. And the topic is, as you know, how to create an inclusive electoral system. Before we go into that, I think we should introduce ourselves. And I'm Jørgen Elklit. I'm a retired political science professor of Aarhus University in Denmark. I now live in Sweden, and that is where I am at the moment, even though my thoughts are in South Africa. In 1993, I was a member of Judge Goldstone's sub-panel preparing for the 94 elections. In 94, I became one of the international commissioners at the IEC, and in 2002, I was a member of Van Slabbert's Electoral Task Team. 2014, I was a visiting professor at University of Cape Town, and I was for 10 years a board member of ISA. I worked with the Inclusive Society Institute. So I think it's fair to say that even though I'm from Scandinavia, I have a fair understanding of the electoral scene in South Africa. And now I think it would be Dr. Mbete's to give an introduction to herself. Please.
Hi, thank you so much, Prof. Elklit. My name is Sithembile Mbete. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Institute. I've worked on electoral issues for slightly a shorter time than the Prof, but still around 14 years now. First at EDASA, which is now closed, working on the 2011 local government elections, and then subsequent to that, working on a number of the elections that have followed. In 2021, I was appointed to the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Electoral Reform to advise the then Home Affairs Minister, Minister Motsoaledi, on the implementation of the new nation judgment that had been passed by the Constitutional Court in 2020. I've written extensively on electoral reform and on the electoral system, and also do a great deal of media commentary and advisory on this work. So really looking forward to being part of this conversation.
And William, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me again on the program. Incidentally, I also studied at the University of Aarhus in the 90s.
Yes.
In Denmark. I'm based at the University of Witwatersrand. And I'm the founder of the Democracy Works Foundations. We do quite a bit of work in the region. It's the largest foundation, democracy building foundation in the region. And I have been working the last couple of years in the political space. I mean, I've facilitated the conversation to get a compromise between the ANC and civil society organizations and opposition parties over the rules for independent candidates. And I co-chaired ahead of the 2024 election, the reform, the discussion on how to produce a draft coalition law. For South Africa, part of that draft is now going through Parliament.
Thank you very much. I think the timing of this webinar is perfect, as it's only some weeks ago that the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel submitted its two reports, one from a majority of 5 and one from a minority of 4 out of the 9 members. And one of the issues they are also dealing with in the two reports is that of inclusivity in various electoral systems as they discuss. So it's very timely. And I think it's necessary first to clarify 2 concepts connected to that. And one of them is electoral systems, because that concept is used in different ways. One of them, and probably the most common one, is to see it as the seat allocation systems. That is how the votes cast by the voters on election day, are transformed into seats or mandates in the parliament, in National Assembly, in the provincial legislatures, and so on. So that's the understanding of the concept. The broader understanding is to take everything connected to elections and see that as part of the electoral system. That is the entire management system, how the INC works at the different levels, how the rules are in that system, how you become a voter, how the party gets on the ballot paper, how votes are counted, and also how the seats are allocated. So the narrow concept is also part of the broader concept. So we have these two different understandings of what an electoral system is. And I think it's important to keep in mind for our discussion. But also when it then comes to inclusivity, because of the two understandings of electoral systems, it's important to remember that inclusivity is seen in two different ways. When we take the narrow electoral system concept first, then normally we say that inclusivity there is the degree to which voters can feel that the vote they casted actually meant something, that it helped to get a party or an independent candidate into parliament, so that the voters feel that they are included in the construction of the membership of the parliament. And that's the narrow understanding of inclusivity. It's not a problem in South Africa because, as it is in both reports, some 97% of all the voters have been able to vote for a party which made it into parliament, and therefore they can feel happy that they contributed, they have a kind of co-ownership of parliament, they feel included, and that is important. And that's one of the ways in which you can assess an electoral system. You would say that 97% is very high, obviously. You should think of the systems as in the UK or the US, where you have majority elections, not proportional elections, where only maybe 50% of the voters actually happen to vote for a candidate who makes it into parliament, and therefore they feel excluded. If we then turn to the broader understanding of electoral system, then inclusivity must mean something different. And I think that's the big issue here. The electoral consultation, electoral reform consultation panel was asked not to look into broader issues, only to concentrate on the narrow one. And I think that's a big mistake, because inclusivity is about all possible voters in a country. It's not about a narrow part. And I think that should be understood. It would be good to go further into that, and we'll do that very soon. It's, in my opinion, a big mistake to do as the consultation panel did, to say it's not in our mandate to discuss broader issues, because it's important how many voters from a country participate in the elections and feel they are part of it. So that is what I would like to say for a start, to introduce the two concepts and to make us clear that inclusivity means different things. Electoral system also can mean different things, but we should focus more on the broader issues than on the narrow ones. Would you agree, Dr. Mbete?
Yes, I would fully. I think that, you know, the statistic that you've given, that in terms of the narrow definition of inclusivity in our system, around 97% of the voters cast a vote that contributed to someone from the party that they voted for making it into the National Assembly, and the same with different provincial legislators. And so in a strict sense, or in a narrow sense, that is a sign of inclusivity. But the reality is that South African voters don't feel that inclusivity. They don't feel that they are, that their vote and their decisions are shaping the parliament and the composition of parliament, neither do they feel that their votes are leading to the election of people who are responsive to their needs, and so and who are responsive to them as voters. And so, the focus on a broader concept of inclusivity, I think, is important for the legitimacy of the system. And I think this is where the shortcoming really is revealed of this very narrow procedural view of the electoral system, just in terms of the rules and what the rules should mean and imply, because the way that the system is felt, is experienced by the majority of people, is not of one that is very inclusive, and it's not one that leads to outcomes that are responsive to people's needs.
Yeah. William, would you like to add anything?
No, absolutely. I mean, our problem right now is that our electoral system really is not bringing accountability to our political system. I mean, some of the core challenges of the lack of inclusivity. The first thing is that voters are represented through multiple parties. That's how our current system works. And so voters are not represented through multiple candidates. So voters do not have a say in getting candidates that they would prefer, because the parties decide on that. And also, voters are not able to select the internal candidates of parties, because got a closed party system. So the parties select their own candidates, and then the voters vote for the parties, and then the parties tell the voters, yes, the candidates. I mean, you can see that's immediately very undemocratic, very underrepresentative. And then also the bigger scale, that voters do not elect the president. The party candidates does that. So what the system has done, our current electoral system, it has boosted party representation. So we've got multiple parties, but what we don't have accountability. So this current system really undermine accountability.
Thank you very much. You're already touching on some of the issues I think we'll be coming back to in various ways. I think the starting point could be to look at the at voter registration, because that is where it starts. In order for an adult South African to come on the voters list, he or she must register, and that's a problem in South Africa, that only, as you know, of course, less than 70% of the eligible voters are on the voters' roll. Of course, the IEC, before every election, has an enormous registration drive, and they register a lot of people, and they boast of that. But the actual fact is, as I said, that only less than 70% of those who could be voters are voters. And why is it that, you already indicated some reasons, that more than 30%, 3 in 10, do not want to become voters in South Africa? Is that only because they feel disappointed for various reasons, or is it laziness, or is it that there is a trend among young people not to get registered? We can see from the analysis of numbers that the higher than average number of non-registrants is among the younger age groups, and in particular the males. So I think that's the first serious problem to address if we want more inclusivity in elections in South Africa. How do we get people to get registered? Is it only because they feel that the system is not delivering solutions to the problems of the country that they turn their back to it, vote by their feet, as the Americans say? Or how should we look at that? And what can we do to amend the situation? Sithembile?
Sure. although our country is young, 70% of the total population is under the age of 40. So 70% of South Africans are under 40. And if you look, so that's completely from 0 to 39. And if you look at eligible voters, voters between the ages of 18, who are above the age of 18 and are eligible to vote, 21.3 million of the around 40 million eligible voters in South Africa are under the age of 40. So people under the age of 40 in last year's election were 54% of the potential voters of the country. And yet, of that proportion, of that age group, rather, less than 50% of them were actually registered to vote in last year's election. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think I do want to preface what I'm about to say, though, with saying that this is an area that hasn't been sufficiently studied in South Africa. So a lot of the literature and the research on voter participation and why it is that people vote focused on who people vote for. So it was very much research that was focused on partisanship. So, which of the parties people will vote for, how long the ANC would maintain its majority as a majority party from 1994. But the idea of voting as a principle, why is it that you choose to participate in the system in general, is an area that's really been underexplored in the academic research in South Africa, and definitely something that I think that it's a big gap that we need to start filling. There's a number of reasons in the literature generally for why people wouldn't vote. There's a lot around resources. So typically people who are more well off, who have high levels of education, who have high levels of social capital, are more likely to participate in voting and in the political system than people who don't, who are lower income, have less education, have less social capital. South Africa bucked those trends from 1994 to around 2014. We weren't typical of most countries in that, the majority of voters in South Africa were low-income voters, in marginalized communities who turned out to vote. Last year's election, from what we can see, I mean, we don't have daily data sets for this, but last year's election is the first one that really backed that trend, that the majority, the highest voter turnout, if you look at the ward level, was in high income, well-resourced areas. The lowest voter turnout was in low income, poorer areas. And that is a big shift in terms of the way in South Africa's politics. The second thing is around how much it takes you to vote. And you've mentioned, Prof, voter registration. So all of these barriers these administrative barriers to participation are a really big thing. And I think in South Africa, we saw that last year, not just with voter, and in the 2021 election, we saw it around voter registration. That you had a sharp decline in voter registration, and the IEC was very proud of itself for making that up in the 2024 elections. But still, the step of needing to register to vote so long before the actual election actually is a disincentive to people, because by the time the campaigns are heating up and people are involved in the in the conversation, in the discourse of the election, and then they realize that they can't register, they can't participate, even if they would have wanted to. And so a lot of countries, a lot of counties in the US have dealt with this by allowing same-day registration for people, or registration, right up until like a week before the election, in order to make it easier for people to participate. We also had the limitations last year on where people could vote. You could only vote at the voting station where you were registered, which also really impacted on the participation of a lot of people. One area that I think is really not studied sufficiently in South Africa is whether there's any impact on like your family and community in socializing a person to being more likely to vote. So what we know from studies in other countries is that families that vote together tend to then, create children, yes, that will then participate in the system, whether you like the system, whether you like who's there, whether you think that, agree with the parties or not. It becomes a habit. And we're not sure whether that is a trend in South Africa. A lot of what comes out of the surveys, of course, is that people are just disillusioned. And yes. That they and that because they don't feel like their vote means anything, they don't feel like the people that they vote for are accountable, they just check out of the system. And we certainly have seen that in the surveys that have come from young people, that speak to young people particularly about why they won't participate in the system. But if you just stick with that view, then there's very little you can do to change the system except for get completely new political actors. And so I think that it is important to consider what are the other things that could motivate people to view the system differently or to view their own participation in the system differently, because unfortunately you can't change the political system if so many people don't participate in the elections.
No, William?
No, absolutely. I mean, in our last election, if the people who registered for votes but did not come on the day to vote, if they had all come and voted for one party, their party would have won. I mean, that story on its own just shows you the significance of those who stayed away. Now, I think there's something to do also with how people perceive what voting is. And we are not doing enough to educate people around voting. And what do I mean by that? Often what happens is that individuals in our kind of societies with our past, when they vote, they see voting almost as supporting a football club. Or even a church, a particular church. So if they vote for a political party, like a football club, they think they have to vote for their party and the party's leaders through thick and thin, no matter what happens. And the problem with that is if the party doesn't deliver, let's just say people voted for the ANC doesn't deliver, and then people then stay away thereafter because they say, well, my party did not deliver, and now I'm not going to vote for any other party because I will betray my party. That's the first part that we really need to engage the whole of society around voting. The second part of it is that people still, because of our history as a country, our past divided history, vote often also based on the past or based on how their family voted, based on communal voting or color voting, and so on, rather than on performance voting. So what we need to do also in this, in our voter education, is to get people to understand that voting is also that you can vote consciously against parties that you may have grown up with, parties that your family grew up with. You can vote against your own preferred party to hold your party accountable. That's the second way that we have to relook at voter education to make people much more conscious around that. The third element around voting is that many South Africans think they can get more out of protesting in the street rather than voting. We've got a culture, anti-apartheid struggle, a culture of protest, and people do think, many people still think that they can change policies through protesting and so on. So often people don't see their vote as more important than, for example, protesting. And that's the other part, how do we get people to change their political culture from protesting to using their vote as the ultimate accountability mechanism?
Yes, thank you. I like your comparison of the political parties with the football clubs, and I think maybe one could see the decline in the ANC support in the last year's election as maybe the same, that some people get dissatisfied with the performances of their team, and therefore they don't come to the matches anymore. They don't start supporting another football club immediately, but at least they don't go to the stadium and see them lose again. So they stay away. And to Dr. Mbete, I would like to mention that research in some other countries than South Africa of voting versus non-voting demonstrates very clearly that very young people, the 18 and 19 years old, who still live at home, as it's often the case, for instance, in Scandinavia, they vote much more than their a little elderly age group members, because they go with their parents to vote. The parents say, now we go and vote, and we shall show you how one does, not in the polling booths, but outside. And therefore, there is much higher participation rate among the 18 and 19 years old than among the 20 to 25, for instance. So there's definitely something to what you say, that it's also a social act in the family, which is important. But I think none of you have mentioned the obvious solution to the registration problem, and that is to go to automatic registration, as a number of other countries do, including both Denmark and Sweden, to mention just two, where it's part of what the state, the system does to make sure that everybody, as part of being a citizen of that particularly country, is, one could say, forced to be on the electoral roll, and then afterwards one can decide for oneself if one wants to vote or not. It does not mean that you should have obligatory voting, but it's an easy way to do it, and you can use ID numbers to make a register of all the voters. So I think it would be the obvious solution in South Africa and in other countries who still have voluntary registration. But it's a complicated issue. I know that discussions between the IEC and Department of Home Affairs have been complicated and will be complicated, and all the problems at Home Affairs will make it difficult to get it accepted. But I think that's the only reasonable solution, and I cannot understand why nobody takes it up and finds a solution. It's a technical issue, it's a political issue, and it would solve at least that part of the problem. Don't you agree?
I agree, and actually there's a paper that I wrote in that was published in December last year by ISA in the Journal for African Elections, where I speak to some degree about having having automatic registration. And because a lot of research that was done around the 2021 local government election actually showed that non-registration was the reason that was given the most by students and young people for not turning out to vote, and saying, it was all these administrative barriers to be able to register. And other than the technical and the administrative issues, as you say, which are logistical, those could be addressed at Home Affairs and working with the IEC. There have also been a number of constitutional court judgments that have seen, or that have been interpreted as reinforcing that free and fair elections are really important, and so having very prescribed, or having a set idea of who's supposed to vote at which voting station is really important in order to maintain free and fair elections. But I think that's the incorrect interpretation of a lot of those judgments of the court, and that there's been, and what you've also seen is that you've seen a blurring between the court's judgment on the local government elections, and the local government elections, which have the direct election component where you vote for an individual at ward level. And so that's, first past the post component of the local government elections, because it's a mixed system. You've seen a lot of the court's judgments around electoral integrity have related to those direct elections at ward level. They don't relate to the broader proportional system that we have at national and provincial elections. And in that electoral system, they don't actually question the sort of the integrity in the way of operating at that level. And so you actually, using the Constitutional Court as the excuse for why it's not possible to do automatic registration, I think is a bit of a red herring, because it's a misinterpretation of the cases and the judgments that have come from the court over the years around electoral integrity. And like you say, I describe the voter registration as being like having a driver's license. It is having a license to drive. You can choose whether you drive or you get a car or whatever, but it enables you to be able to participate, to be able to be a driver in the electoral system and in the voting and in the political system. And so empowering people with that, you could do automatic registration when people get their ID at the age of 16. And it just means that you have the license and you can choose whether you use it or not.
Yes, no, it's absolutely important that we make voting easier. If it means we allow for automatic registration and so on, it could be perhaps, say, at a national level, or we could do it at a local level. We could choose, we could pilot and see what could work. But the second thing is also, we must also make it easier for voters to show disapproval of all political parties. So, for example, if you're a voter and you're not happy with any of the political parties, any of the political leaders, we must allow that voter to express it on the ballot. For example, what we could do is add an extra box. And I know, because we've got so many political parties, that ballot it's a very, very long, big, extended ballot. But there is still, I think we could still think of adding another box there that says, I am not happy with any of the parties. And then perhaps at the end, when we all counted, if, for example, the people who are not happy, the voters are not happy with all of the parties are the majority, we managed to rerun the elections. But I mean, the important thing is how do we help voters to, one, make it easy for them to vote, but secondly, what we could do is allow them to express their disagreement if they disagree with all of the parties, but expressing it on the ballot, formally on the ballot. And then thirdly, we have to get the voter education right. I mean, we've possibly done very little voter education. I mean, the only voter education that's happening is the political parties telling their supporters how to vote. So there is a misunderstanding of what voter education is. I mean, as I say, political parties think voter education is to show the voters how they should vote for a particular party. We must explain a vote means many, many different things, and that you can vote against a party, you can vote for other parties, you don't necessarily need to vote the way your family votes or your community votes, and so on. And I think, so we'll have to get better voter education, and we have to broaden voter education, also bring other players into voter education. For example, maybe we can make it compulsory. If you go to university, for example, that you are on a voter education, that you're part of the orientation, that you do there will be a voter education element. We can say the same for business. If you join a company, that is compulsory in that orientation, that the company rollouts a voter education. I would even say if you get a basic income grant, that is compulsory, that part of that you get a voter education training that is part of that package of civic education, because you get state resources that you get that voter education as a compulsory component.
It's excuse me. It's to me it sounds very interesting that you bring that up 30 years into some kind of democracy in the country. We did a lot of voter education campaigns in '94 to communities where voting was not possible before '94. And I'm surprised to hear that the media system and the educational system and so on has not succeeded in making that something of the past, where that people should have learned by now. At least some of them have learned that if you don't go and vote, then you don't support some of the parties because you don't appreciate what they're doing in Parliament. So it's a very far-reaching question you bring up with more voter education, and in different ways. I would have thought that the media have an extremely important role to play, and the political parties, of course, they will try to present things so they themselves look good in the situation. But opening discussions between different parties in what would you call it in English? Meetings before, during the electoral campaign, where different parties come together and discuss, as you see in many countries, public discussions on television and so on, is one way of teaching people how to separate their sympathy for one party to a more critical assessment of what the different parties do. So that is something I have not really considered. I thought voter education by now would not be so important as it used to be.
So voter education, as far as where to put your X, and actually quite a lot, in last year's election, given that there was a new ballot, there was a new system in some ways, there was a lot fewer, we were expecting a much higher rate of spoiled votes. So people who just filled in the ballots incorrectly than in previous years. And there wasn't a huge amount of difference, actually. There were about the same number, around the same percentage of spoiled votes, same percentage of spoiled votes in last year's election as they were in previous elections. So in terms of knowing the mechanics of the system, I think the system works quite effectively in the teaching of that. I think what William's mentioning a lot more is the civic education, and we don't have civic education in our basic education system. There've been a lot of struggles over the years around, including that more as a specific part of the curriculum in the basic education phase. And I think it's more important to have it there than at university, because we know that around 48% or 45% of children who start school in any given year will have dropped out by this time that schooling stopped being compulsory in grade 9. And so, you want to be able to stop being compulsory for grade 10. So you want to be able to reach everybody, whether they may remain in the educational system into the tertiary phase or not. And so we do need to have civic education. And despite people's, popular belief, the IEC's mandate for civic education is actually quite limited. So the IEC has a mandate to promote civic education. It has a responsibility to teach about voting, and that's the mechanics of voting, but it's no broader really than that. So there is a gap that we, unlike Ghana, for example, which has a civic education commission, a statutory body that is responsible to do civic education. We don't have that in South Africa. We don't have neither do we have dedicated civics as a class or as a course within the basic education system. And what we've seen is that because of all sorts of crises with the public broadcaster, is that kind of public public interest programming has also declined over time. And the importance of it is beyond just the elections. There was a question here from somebody called Lawrence about why are political parties necessary? What exactly are the benefits of having political parties? I can't see any. And, having civic education would be really important to have discussion and to explain what the role of political parties is supposed to be in a democracy. Political parties are supposed to be the aggregators of social interests and different social views. They aggregate people with different political views, different social views, and then allow that to be expressed en masse. Because in a representative democracy, we can't all directly participate in decision making because there's too many of us, unlike ancient Greece. And so you have a representation and people elect representatives. And the best way to aggregate people that are like-minded is through political parties. But what we have in South Africa is that we have profoundly undemocratic political parties. I always say that the weakest link in our system is the political parties, who are treated in our law as private clubs. So if you're part of a chess club or a knitting club, you have the same legal status as a political party in the South African system in terms of our law. Parties are governed by private law, not by public. And so what that means is that there's a big distance actually between political parties and the people that they seek to represent. And that is one of the underlying factors, I think, to the issues of accountability that we see in our system.
I think it's very good that you took a moment to look into the questions we are getting, because there are actually quite a number of questions running behind the screen. Many of them relate to what we are discussing now about constitutionality of registration, age limits, and so on and so forth. And I hope that some of the people who ask questions will feel that in the way the discussion here is moving forward, they also get at least answers to some of their questions. But I think it's important to just to finalize this part of it, to say that the registration percentage, the 70% or slightly less, and the voter turnout percentage in last year's election of less than 60% means, as it has been said, that only 40% of the eligible voters participated in last year's election. That is, 60% of the entire adult population did not. And what can be done to make them participate in order to make South African democracy develop further and be stronger and all of that. And some of the questions ask about whether or not proportional representation is a solution to that. And of course it is. I think it's not a question of moving away from proportional representation in South Africa. It would not be a good idea from a democratic point of view. It would also be unconstitutional, of course, and because the Constitution requires an electoral system which is, as it said, in general, secures proportional representation in Parliament. I think, to take up something I've been thinking about, that the little "in general" has been taken by some commentators in South Africa to mean that there must be a very mathematically correct level of proportionality. But as I understand it, in general, it's not that strict. It is an indication of that it's possible to have slightly higher level of disproportionality than is now the case. Most of the countries with proportional representation do not have as high a level of proportionality as South Africa. It's not the case in Denmark, it's not the case in Sweden, it's not the case in Germany or New Zealand or Lesotho or what you can use to compare with. So a more relaxed attitude there, so that it doesn't need to be so that South Africa is a world leader in proportionality, because that makes some of the possible solutions to some of the problems impossible. But overall, of course, proportional representation is something which is necessary in South Africa, both for legal and moral reasons. I think it would be a good idea if we moved a little bit into the question of...
Can I
yes, sure.
come in terms of, I don't come back to the political parties, because if we want to change the electoral system, we also have to look at the reform of our political parties to make them more accountable, because even if we change the system, but our political parties are not accountable, there will still be flaws and people will still be reluctant to vote or to register to vote. So I think there's a couple of key things that we need to reform of our political party system. I think the first thing is we have to make political parties more accountable. We cannot have political parties that are elite clubs. I would make a case and an argument that political parties, the moment they get funding, public funding, they become public institutions that has to be held accountable. So they can't be private clubs. You're a public institution, you get taxpayers' money. And then because of that, then there is a higher standard for accountability, where there's the accountability in how they finance the operations and how they use their money, but also accountability in terms of how they, for example, the internal elections, and accountability on their policies and accountability on the constitutionality. If you're a political party, you get state funding, you cannot go against the constitution, or you cannot be violent, and so on. So we have to be stricter laws to hold political parties accountable, so that we prevent anti-constitutional policies, anti-constitutional statements by parties and leaders and policies, and so on. I mean, we're a non-racial society. If a political party gets funding, for example, from the public purse, if leaders now weaponize our racial differences, then that political party, I would say, funding must be withdrawn. Public funding must be withdrawn. And the same, for example, if a political party leader is violent, or the party members are violent, the funding needs to be taken off, or the party needs to be deregistered. So we have to be absolutely strict at the same time to hold our political parties accountable. And it means also for the internal workings of these political parties. If political parties are public institutions, they also have to have things like, gender equality in their leadership, internal democracy, and so on.
I understand what you are saying, but I must say that I do not necessarily agree with all of it, because I think it's a dangerous route to take to legalize about political parties in all kinds of details in order to make them more accountable. I think it's for the voters to decide if they like what the parties are doing, and therefore what can be done is to have a system where it's easier, much easier than now, to hold individual politicians accountable, instead of making regulations for what parties can or should do. It's for the voters to say if they like what the parties are doing, and if they are confident that they will work for the benefits of all in the country according to their political viewpoints and so on. I think it's important not to be too detailed in the regulation of political parties, despite them having access to the public person and all of that. So for me, the best way to deal with these questions is to make it possible for voters much more directly to hold individual politicians accountable, and in that way ensure that corrupt or incapable politicians are not getting into parliament. And therefore, I think it's easier to look at the electoral system as such and make it easier for voters to hold politicians directly accountable than to make very long-ranging regulations of what political parties can and should do. And you have to remember, of course, that the legislation about this would have to be done in the National Assembly, and I'm afraid that at least some of the members would not like to have very strict regulations for either their own or the party's behavior. So I think it's important to look into the details, and also because time is running, of what we could do to change the electoral system in the narrow sense of the word, to make it easier for voters to hold politicians directly and individually accountable. And I think, and it has been discussed, and it's also discussed in the consultation panel, of course, in their two reports, whether one should move to a system with smaller constituencies, where it would be easy for voters to put a name and a face to the political parties' candidates in those smaller constituencies, and therefore know what they've been doing, have these politicians come and defend themselves and their behavior during the electoral campaign, not as part of somebody behind the party leader, but as someone who is on the ballot paper in a small district. And that would, of course, also require some kind of open list system instead of the closed list we have now. And I know that it has been debated a lot over the last at least 3 decades. Some people think it's a good idea, some people think it's a bad idea. I belong to those who think it would be a very good idea. And we see that in many other countries, that open lists are a way for ordinary voters to assess and to grade what people are doing in Parliament and kick out the rascals and vote for those they like and who promise convincingly to do something better. So therefore, a system which requires smaller constituencies than is now the case, and open list would be a way forward. And I think there in broad circles are a full understanding of that, but some people think that it's not a good idea because that might question or challenge their possibilities for continuing in the system, and therefore they are against it by all means. So that would be one solution in my understanding. I suppose I'm quite sure you would agree to that.
I think that, having smaller constituencies. So there's a question about the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, and that report was never discussed. It was never tabled in Parliament. So it was submitted to Cabinet, and then it was basically shelved. Yeah. It was never put for public discussion in Parliament, and with a broader consultation process after that. And that recommendation for much smaller multi-member constituencies that would allow the proportional representation to play out, but in much smaller geographical districts, I think is certainly something that needs to be considered for a reformed system, and it is something that's spoken about in the Electoral Commission consultation panel report. I think that there's also a need to think, now that the Constitutional Court has made its judgment around independent candidates, and I think that something that South Africans, because we're fed up with our political parties, don't realize that independent candidates don't get elected in most places in the world. So in Germany, which has the most similar system to ours, is most similar system to our local government level, but election system, but they have it at national level. I think there's a handful of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 independent candidates that have ever been elected in their system. Parties still play a role in systems where independents can run. You even see it in systems with first past the post elections, that people that are elected are still, for the majority, party candidates, because political parties serve this really important role of aggregating resources and for policy development. The only country that I can think of that doesn't have political parties is Eswatini, and I'm not sure that that's exactly what we want. And so I think that having smaller districts, having a way for people to connect directly with the candidates as individuals, so through an open list system. I love the single transferable vote system that they have in Ireland, right, which is proportional representation, but that works with individuals, whether those individuals are political party representatives or are independent candidates. There are options to be able to have the kind of direct representation that people want and to have the accountability mechanisms. I think that the other thing, and this is going to be my last point, is that our civic education system really doesn't teach people. We don't teach people about all the different ways that they can engage with politicians and with the system in between elections. And so that's also part of the reliance on protest, right? But there are all sorts of methods for participation that we have built into our constitutional system that haven't really been used adequately. And so you hold people to accountable, yes, through elections, but also in between elections. And then last thing is that electing the president directly would require constitutional amendment. And there's actually a lot that we can do within the current constitutional frame to deal with some of the issues that we have around inclusivity and particularly around accountability that aren't explored sufficiently.
Yes.
Yeah, now, I don't want to go into the details, but I think a core element of reform, what we need to look at just so broadly, I think the first thing what we need to do is to give when we change the system to give voters a greater ability to directly elect candidates. I think that's very, very important. So, whatever, as we reform the system, that's a very, very important pillar. And then what we need to try to do is to get a combination of candidates directly elected, and combine that with a greater direct voter say in how party candidates are also elected. So if we can get that combination right, finding a way to get more to get voters to vote for candidates directly, and secondly also to get voters to directly vote for to get party candidates to elect party candidates. So it's not a party leaders that elect party candidates. Then for me, the other reform that you have to look at is to get voters to recall incompetent, corrupt, and violent elected representatives. Because right now, at a national level, voters cannot do that, because if a party, if an elected representative is violent, is corrupt, is incompetent, voters cannot recall that person. Then what we also need to do is we must get a way to get more independent, so non-party candidates to be elected also into cabinet. Right now, our cabinet allows for 2 individuals who are not party members. And in the past, the ANC, because they were a majority party, always appointed people from the unions or from the Communist Party, those 2 positions. But what we need to try to get non-party people to be elected into cabinet also. And then on the independent candidates, the weakness that we've so far with independent candidates, we are not treating. What we need to do is treat independent candidates almost as political parties. They must get the same resources. When I was chairing or facilitating the negotiations to try to get independent candidates a better dispensation, sadly, in that process, the parties that were already in parliament try to make it very difficult for independent candidates, to be resourced. They try to disadvantage independent candidates. So we must look at, there are many other models, for example, in Ireland, where independent candidates are almost treated as political parties. They get the same resources and so on. That is why Ireland has now, second time now, an independent candidate is actually the president, because the system is actually helping independent candidates. But whatever new system we get, it must still be simple to administer. If it's not easy to administer, it's also going to be very difficult to implement. But it must also be relatively simple for voters to navigate any new system.
Yes, that's very clear. I think a problem we have not at all talked about, but is very much related to this, is the number of political parties on the ballot paper. And I think it's part of the problem that there are so many parties now on the ballot paper that most voters, also those with a clear connection to a political party, get confused. The requirements for getting on the ballot paper could easily be increased considerably without invalidating South African democracy or individuals' right to stand for election. To say that only so few signatures as are now needed is enough to get on the ballot paper is very strange in my opinion. And I think one could easily increase it by a factor 5, for instance, to 75% of the price for a seat in the previous election, so that one could cut down the number of parties on the ballot paper to at least parties who have just a small chance of making it into parliament, instead of all kinds of frivolous and strange parties who never ever has a chance to get in. So I think that would be a big help for many voters. And as Dr. Mbete mentioned, independent candidates are very rarely elected in any country. It's possible also in Denmark, in my country, to stand as an independent, but only once in 100 years, more than 100 years, has one person been elected. It's not a danger which can ruin the system in any way. And whether they should be treated exactly like political parties or as independents is an open question, which is not very important, because the issue of independent candidates is not itself very important. The other things I think we need to just touch upon at the very end of this webinar is there was a message, sorry, what the formal threshold should be for getting into parliament. Now, as you know, there's no threshold whatsoever, so parties with down to 0.17% can make it into parliament. And you see, not many, but some of these one-member parties making it. The majority report from the consultation panel suggests to increase that to the price of one seat in the previous elections. That is 0.249%. That is to increase it with so little that it's, in my opinion, just a joke. It could be 2%, for instance, as in many other countries, or 4%, in order to cut down on the number of very small parties, to increase the visibility of the bigger parties, and to make it easier to form coalitions. Think about the situation if there had been a 2% limit last year with only 6 parties in parliament. Coalition formation after the election would have been different, at least, and the GNU would have been a different animal, and to the benefit of us all in South Africa. I think we are approaching the end of this webinar, and I want to thank you very much, Dr. Mbete and Prof. Gumede, for your contribution. It has been very good to talk to you and with you, and I apologize to the many people who have asked questions. We have not had time to answer you directly, but some of your points have been taken up in the discussion. So I want to thank you all in the audience, and also the Inclusive Society Institute and the Daily Maverick for having hosted this opportunity to talk about very important issue for the future of South African democracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Goodbye.